Since I cannot read instructions, I'm actually installing the JTR transmission mounts in the wrong place. I'm installing them where the original mounts used to be because to me that seems like a much stronger location than mounting them to the floor. I cut away the sides of the original brackets and mounted the JTR brackets to the remainder of the factory bracket as well as the cross member that is spot welded to the floor. The bolts do not run all the way through into the car. The bolt head actually sits below the floor of the car, and I will show this in detail later. Here's what I was talking about with the bolt heads. So I think the brackets were supposed to be down here somewhere so that you would have just been drilling a hole straight through the floor. But because I mounted them to the original transmission support structure, I had to hog these holes out here because there's nothing between the floor and that structure. So if I would have ran the bolt all the way through and tightened it down, it just would have crushed the two of them together, which would not have been great. So that's why the holes are all hogged out. And then these ones, I got a little bit too close to the edge of that structure. So they're pretty much just bound up against the edge of the structure. So I don't even really have to get a socket on them. Anyways, I mean, it's not real ideal. I'm going to have to come up with a way of covering these up that can still be undone in case I ever need to get to them again. But in the long run, I think mounting the brackets to that spot welded structure will be stronger than just mounting it to the floor. Working on the wiring harness for the transmission, there isn't much to it. It's just that reverse switch right there, and then the speed sensor on the tail shaft. The only other electrical thing is that servo right there, but I'm not hooking that up. As far as working on this little wiring harness, what I have, because I have it pulled up here. So I have the reverse switch, which tied into the original reverse switch wiring for the Datsun. It's just like a blue wire and a blue and white striped wire, I think. I don't think the direction matters, so I just hooked it up. The other plug here for the speed sensor, it's hard to tell because the wires are pretty gross, but there's a purple wire, which from what I read on a forum, so we're automatically in trouble there. But I couldn't find an actual wiring diagram for it, so the forum post was the best I could come up with. And according to this guy, this purple wire needs to ground to the engine block, and this wire here, which is supposed to be yellow, is your actual signal wire. So the yellow signal wire is what I ran all the way back through this plug, and it goes, well, it changes color just because that's the way this goes, and it goes to the Intellitronics gauges, and then the ground, it runs up here, and I'm going to try and have one master ground that's in an easy place to get to and inspect, because I don't want to have a bunch of ground wires all over the place. I mean, at least if there's a problem, I just have one ground wire to check. So that pretty much concludes the wiring for the transmission. This other wire here is for the starter. I updated my little sketch for this plug. So I mentioned it in the other wiring videos, but the whole point of these plugs being here is these plugs allow you to isolate and remove one part of the wiring harness. So you can unplug these plugs here and pull this whole thing up and drag it off to the side. So I reused these plugs from a GM wiring harness, and so the wire colors are not really accurate. But what I did is I made this little sketch here. So if you're looking at the female side of the plug, This is what all the wires do. Same deal with that 4-pin one. So that way, if I ever have to look into this, I can, you know, I have this at least to help me, because once all this is wrapped up and taped up, there's going to be no way to figure any of this out. So I would say putting little sheets together like this is real important with the wiring harness. Getting ready to weld up, or at least tack up, the transmission cross member. So I ran into a little bit of an issue. I think it's going to work out fine though, but that ZF transmission has the shifter set off to the driver's side. So that makes it effectively, you know, real wide compared to a transmission that has just the shifter and the tail shaft more centered in it. So the result of that is it barely fits in the transmission tunnel. So if you can see the motor mounts, the engine is offset to the passenger side as far as these motor mounts will allow it to be. I don't remember what the exact number is. I have it written on a piece of paper that we'll look at in a second. And so to measure how offset it was, I took a piece of this balancer installing tool, so I had something that could get the center of the crank, and then I scribed a mark down the center of this little tool, and that gave me something to measure off of. So I could measure from this frame rail over to the center of that, and from the other frame rail to the center of it, and figure out how offset the engine was, because I needed to know that information, because the transmission has to be, well, disclaimer, I've never done this before, so I'm kind of going off of my own intuition and what I read. But I know the engine and transmission need to be parallel to the car. Otherwise, if the engine and transmission are kicked off this way, then you're going to have a different angle at the U-joint at the yoke versus the angle at the U-joint for the diff, and then you get a drive shaft vibration. So I had to figure out this offset so that I could make sure that the tail shaft of the transmission had the same offset. And in my mind, that ought to make this thing perfectly parallel to the body of the car, and thus parallel to the diff. All right, so after messing with this for quite a while, my notes started getting a little messy. But best I could figure, there was 29/32 of offset from the balancer to the passenger side. And then, so that allowed me to figure out the center line of everything. I could figure out how much it was offset. And what I ended up with, the other deal is the way I was measuring off the yoke, which I'll show in a second, is I had a string tied to the side of the yoke, and so the string went from the top of the yoke down to the bottom of it and straight down, and that's how I was figuring up a good way of measuring where the tail shaft was at, because I took that measurement and then I factored in the fact that the string was offset on the yoke because it was on the side of the yoke. So I figured out where the center line of the yoke was. So the yoke was 1 and 23/32 wide. Anyways, divide that by 2. That gives you how much offset this string is to the driver's side. So what I ended up figuring out is that with the offset that the engine had, the 29/32, and the the 859 thousandths of offset for the string on the side of the yoke, I figured up that that plumb bob needed to be 26 3/4 of an inch from the passenger side and 26 7/8 from the driver's side. And what I was measuring from was the seam on the rocker. So this is really, I think, only going to be relevant to this car. Every car is probably going to be different, and this is more of just me explaining the process in case I ever have to figure out how or why I did this. The 2 degrees, I just measured it with my phone as best I could. I used I think it was like the Spicer toolbox or something like that. Best I could figure is about 2 degrees on the diff, so I did 2 degrees on the transmission where they're both parallel to each other. It's 2 degrees in the same direction. Under the car now, so this is what I was talking about with the string and everything. So you see it's clamped up there, and then I rotated the yoke until the string was just barely grazing the bottom section of the yoke. And then that gave me something really easy to measure off of. I just measured off the point of that. So a lot of assumptions were made in the measuring of all this. One of them is that that little hole in the subframe that bolt is stuck into, and this one, assumed that those were in line. I couldn't come up with a good thing to measure off of under here because there really isn't a frame rail. And, you know, if I measure here on the frame rail, well, that's a different measurement than right here, which is different than right here because nothing is straight under here. So that was the best I could come up with. And then I measured from, I just clipped the tape measure on the, the lap weld there of the rocker, the seam, and ran down the string. The string also helped me make sure that I was getting the tape measure relatively perpendicular. So as long as the tape measure was lining up good with the string, then I assumed it was pretty perpendicular. And then from there, I could go measure off to this guy. And then I did the same thing on the passenger side. So I think the transmission is about where it's supposed to be. I got the jack. It was easier to set the level of the transmission first because I had to have everything apart to do that, to be able to get my phone in there to measure the angle. So I did that first, and then I got the transmission lined up side to side where I wanted it to be. So that is that, and then I just measured off of the flange there for the diff. I just put my phone right on it, made sure it was relatively clean when I did that. Alright, so best I can tell using my phone, the flange on the diff is what we're looking at here, and it's 2 degrees counterclockwise. So effectively the top of that flange is further back towards the car than the lower part of it. So it's 2 degrees counterclockwise. So I set the transmission at the same level. It's tilted 2 degrees back, so the tail shaft is 2 degrees down. So if I understand angles right, that should mean that both of them are parallel to each other, which should mean a happy drive shaft. So now I have this cross member, and I'm going to tack it up for now, and then get it out of the car and weld it up with a welder that has a little more gumption to it. But kind of what I have going here is the original brackets for the kit, which I've, since cut the ends off of. And I got to trim on them a little bit more, but they're going to get welded to this piece of 1/8 inch wall, 1 inch square tubing. This joint here is bolted so that this theoretically can be unbolted, and I can pull the cross member out in order to get the transmission out, because I don't want to have to undo these brackets ever again, because it's just going to be a hassle to get to them. So that's why this is bolted. Welded to this guy. This piece is actually one of the ends from the JTR transmission cross member, because it lined up, it was 7/16 bolts fit in them really good, and it has a little bit of side-to-side play. So what I did is it's bolted to the transmission mount, and then what I'm going to do is obviously weld it here, but then I'm going to weld these washers to this piece. That way that locates the transmission side to side, because otherwise it'll let the transmission slide side to side, and what I'm trying to avoid that whole thing. So these washers are lined up now. I'll tack them on. This mount is from the, I believe, the 68 GMC. I think this is the original transmission mount to it. So it seemed like it was in decent shape, so I'm gonna go ahead and use it unless it starts falling apart, but at the very least it's really good for mock-up. This piece up here I think is like 3/16 steel, I think. Anyways, this plate here is what's adapting the transmission to this mount, because this guy uses a 7/16 bolt here, but also on the side, and the tail shaft of the ZF transmission accepts a 7/16 bolt. So this bolt here is going through both the mount and the transmission and this adapter. So this adapter runs all the way across, and you can see there's another bolt there, so it's supporting the other end of the mount. Whoop, where are we at? And then you see it runs down here and ties into the other bolt for the tail shaft mount. So it's got 3 bolts going through it, and this bolt here goes through everything, and the other 2 are just tying the rest of it together. So I think that'll be pretty snazzy. We'll just have to see though. I'm gonna go ahead and get it tacked in, and then gotta take all this apart. Okay, on today's episode of Don't Judge the Welds, stick welded these, and I've never had the problem with stick welding where it ends up with cavities in it, but for whatever reason, I don't know what was going wrong with it, but I just kept feeding rod into it, so now we have that big giant mess. That one actually turned out pretty good though. I was pleased with that one, but that one is by far the worst of it. On this side, I ended up putting this bolt here and welding it in place. And that's because this is right up against the transmission, and there's not going to be room to put a nut on there. So that's why that guy's there. Then this guy's all welded up too. So there's that. Transmission is back out of it. The motor is suspended because I gotta do some clearancing in here. So this corner over here hits in this area, so that needs a little bit of help. Well, I think it's that area. Actually, it might be down here. I don't know. Just hammer around on everything. And then this side, the bell housing is hitting right where that scratch is. So I got my clearancing tool. So we'll do some clearancing. And the other clearancing problem I was having was the communist shift solenoid here that was locking. So I read it locked you out of 4th and 3rd gear and made you go from 2nd to 5th. But I don't think that's right based on playing around with this one. I think this one locks you out of just 4th, so you have to go from 3rd to 5th. So it requires a special wrench to get it off, which I didn't have. It requires, I don't know what size it is, but the wrench has to be really, really thin. So what I did is I just tapped around on this guy one way until I broke the crimp part, and then gently came back the other way and the whole thing fell off. I mean, just tapping around on it, I didn't want to break the casing of the transmission or anything. So I just tapped around on it until that came loose. Then we had this guy in here, which you can see there's where the wrench is supposed to grab it, but it's got to be a really, really thin wrench. So what I did that probably is going to make the engineers who made this cry is I just took an old pipe wrench. I got an old pipe wrench on it with a short cheater pipe and got it broke loose. The wrench came flying off violently towards my face. That was kind of cool. And from there, what was in there was this little piston. This little guy here. So that's the normal position for it, but sure enough, if you have it anywhere other than the 3-4 row, you can push it in and it will lock you out of 4th. It'll let you go to 3rd, but then it locks you out of 4th and you can't get it into 4th gear. So that guy needs to go away. And then I got to figure out how to plug this hole. Alright, so I turned that little piece into a plug. So I went ahead and welded the hole closed, ground it down, and then I wasn't entirely confident on being able to clean out the inside, so I put some RTV in there after I washed it out, just in case there's anything left in there. I didn't want it to fall down into the transmission. And then I ground the ears off of this flat so that I can get a wrench on it now. Well, as improbable as it sounds, I screwed something up here. If you note the slight interference fit between the distributor cap and the hood latch, that's not really going to work. So whenever I was bragging about how far the motor could be set back, I forgot to consider this. So even with the motor pulled as far forward as the motor mounts will let me, I still don't have a whole lot of clearance here. So right now, this distributor would work. The problem is I was really trying to get one of these big cap HEIs to work. So that way, if the car ever had an ignition problem, I could theoretically just throw one of these in and it would be ready to go. The problem with these small cap HEIs is they don't have a mechanical advance, they don't have a vacuum advance, because they rely on a computer to tell them what to change the timing to. So the Megasquirt computer in the car that I put together, I'll have to change some stuff on it, because ironically I had it set up to run one of these, or to run one of these ignition modules whenever the L28 was still in this car, when I was trying to get that to work. And then I changed it to a coil negative setup because I thought the problem was the Megasquirt computer. It turned out to be the Nissan stuff. But anyways, so I could run this distributor off the Megasquirt, but what I don't like about that is if the Megasquirt has a problem, then the best I'll be able to do is unplug the signal wire from the distributor, and it will basically lock the distributor out at some degrees of timing. Like I could manually, you know, set it at 20 degrees or 15 degrees and it'll just stay there. So it wouldn't necessarily leave the car stranded, but it would kind of suck. So that's going to be the downside of this, but I think I can fix the computer back where it'll run this distributor, and then, you know, we'll have to build a ignition table for it, but there's really no other way around it because of this hood latch here. I mean, there's really not much I can do with this because the distributors are so tall. And a Vortex style one would be awesome because those caps are really, really low because they shoot the plug wires off to the side. But those distributor bodies don't even have a pickup in them at all. So this is pretty much the only option for me, at least. So we're gonna have to figure something out with this later. So I went ahead and re-drilled the transmission bracket, which was so much fun doing underneath the car, you know, drilling 7/16 holes straight up. But I got that fixed, so the distributor has a decent amount of clearance now. So that's good. All right, the mediocre looking cross member looks even more mediocre now that it has these little nubs sticking out, but I can trim those off later if I want to. Also, I did check that the transmission is still lined up in the car the way that it is supposed to be. So that's all good. So I think we are good under here. While we're here, might as well show just how tight of a fit this transmission is. So passenger side, we're looking pretty good. It's a little tight up here, but not bad at all. I gotta fill that hole in for that bolt with some kind of epoxy or something because it got way too close to the side there and blew the metal out. You'll have that. So as far as space here, we're doing pretty decent. Where this thing is a tight fit is up here on this side. So you can see I got two bolts up there. One of them is actually welded to the mount, and the other one is just kind of hanging out. So they both clear, but it is not by much. This side of the transmission is really, really tight against the transmission tunnel. This was the side that was giving me all the problems, such as this lockout solenoid here. If this guy was still here, it would be probably hitting the transmission tunnel too. But now that we blocked that off, got room for days. So yeah, this transmission will technically fit in one of these cars, but not well. And then you can see how much I had to cut out of the original shifter location here. It used to come across right here, and I had to cut out all of that in order for this thing to fit. So remains to be seen how that's going to work for the interior, but it just is what it is. I'm going to have to make it work. But anyways, finally going to call this part of the project done. The motor and transmission are located in the car. With that, the Datsun has a motor and transmission in it. Ignore the fact that this is the wrong motor that's going in this car, but it's got a motor nonetheless. So just quick recap. The center line of the wheel there, looking straight up. So the vast majority of the motor is still behind the center line of the front wheels, so I'm happy with that. The engine is offset to the passenger side as far as this mount kit will let it go. And that is mostly to try and get the transmission to fit correctly inside the transmission tunnel. So if you have a smaller transmission, probably not going to have to scoot the motor over anywhere near as far as I did. It's just that S640 is just a massive transmission for this car. And you can see the oil pan down there. We still have a good clearance between the power steering rack and the pan. So all that clearancing worked out pretty good. Still didn't need to go back quite as far as I did, but they worked out fine nonetheless. Just as long as the windage tray bolts clear the pan, we should be good there. My transmission wiring harness, much to my surprise, actually fit, because I was just kind of guessing on the lengths there. But anyways, motor and transmission's in the car. Took forever to get here, but that is a massive step for this car. Thanks for watching.